The Falcons' new wide receiver coach hire means that we might finally invest in some speed this offseason.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs, who are helping you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. And guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Sirius Black, aka Mr. Drew, aka Mr. AKA. And of course, I'm coming at you from an undisclosed location here in Mobile, Alabama. We'll be talking about Senior Bowl standouts all week long. We'll talk more about the Senior Bowl quarterbacks, maybe even talk about some of the quote-unquote big three quarterbacks by the end of today's episode. But of course, we appreciate each and every one of you that is an everydayer that has tuned in all week long, even though there's been some technical difficulties at some points, dealing with the hotel Wi-Fi and all that stuff and shoddy microphones and all that stuff. We appreciate you, all you everydayers. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So, as I said, we'll talk more Senior Bowl stuff towards the end of the episode, some standouts of the week, talk about the quarterbacks and whether or not those guys were able to raise their stock or lower their stock over the course of this practice week. But first, we got to talk again about the continuing filling out of the Falcons coaching staff under new head coach Raheem Morris. And we have another reported hire today with wide receivers coach, former NFL wide receiver Ike Hilliard, taking on that role. And you may remember hired from his playing days in the Jim Fossil era Giants in the late 90s and early 2000s. He finished his career with the John Gruden era Tampa Bay Buccaneers, where they had a young assistant coach by the name of Raheem Morris. And then a few years later, Ike got into coaching himself, eventually serving as a wide receivers coach for the Washington Redskins. I was about to call them Commanders in 2012 under Mike Shanahan, offensive coordinator Kyle Shanahan, where they had a young defensive backs coach by the name of Raheem Morris. And Hilliard and Morris worked for 2 years together in D.C. in 2012 and 2014. Between that time, Hilliard was the Bills wide receivers coach. And then when he came back under Jay Gruden in 2014 with Washington, he'd stay in Washington through 2019. Of course, Raheem went on to come here in Atlanta in 2015 through 2019. And then Hilliard spent 2 years as the Steelers wide receivers coach in 2020 and 2021. And then most recently was the Auburn wide receiver coach at college in 2022. Now, some of the receivers that Hilliard had a hand in developing during that decade plus long career in the NFL, Terry McLaurin, who had that breakout rookie season in Washington, his final year, Hilliard's final year in Washington. Jamison Crowder was another guy that he had success with in Washington developing. Deontay Johnson's best years in Pittsburgh came while Hilliard was there. Now, when you look at some of the other players that were high draft picks that did not work out for those respective teams, you think of players like Chase Claypool, Josh Doxson, right? Although technically Claypool's best years did come when Hilliard was in Pittsburgh. But, Washington, through most of that time with Hilliard, relied on more veteran receivers like Pierre Garçon and Deshaun Jackson. And so, the thing that you notice about that sort of trend is these sort of faster, quicker, more explosive wide receivers like the McLaurins, the Jamison Crowders, the Deontay Johnsons tended to have more success. And the bigger, more physical receivers like the Chase Claypools and the Josh Doxsons did not quite. Juju Smith-Schuster did not have the same success during Hilliard's 2 years there as he had the previous 2 years. And Juju's kind of, borderline. Like, he's a big guy, but he's more of a slasher type of a slot guy than anything else in terms of physicality. So, if you happen to be a person that wants to see the Falcons add some speed, add some more quickness, add guys that can separate, you kind of like this hire, right? With Ike Hilliard, he's been able to develop more of those guys than not. And a certain humble podcast host may be one of those people that is pushing for the Falcons to add that. So we'll see what happens on that front. You do wonder a little bit, though, is that an Ike Hilliard thing, or is that just kind of the general trend that has been the case in the NFL for like the last 5 to 7 years, is that we're moving away from the sort of bigger, more physical wide receivers that were sort of popular and du jour for the beginning part of, this past decade, the height of Julio Jones and all those guys, and moving more towards, the league being dominated by the Tyreek Hills and the Stephon Diggses and the Calvin Ridleys and those types of receivers that were Terry McLaurin on that list as well. So that's an interesting conversation and debate and argument that we're not going to be able to resolve here on today's episode. But at least as far as that concerned, if the Falcons are moving in that direction, I expect the Falcons will be moving in that direction under new offensive coordinator Zach Robinson. I think Ike Hilliard is a capable coach, that can get the most out of that group. And now we will see what happens with the Falcons wide receiver core this offseason. It could be a complete revamp because you have 4 impending free agents in Mac Hollins, Van Jefferson, Scotty Miller, and Kadero Hodge. Obviously, Van Jefferson has some experience with Raheem Morris and Zach Robinson from his days in Los Angeles with the Rams, although, Van Jefferson didn't quite live up to expectations, but maybe they could bring him back there at least. And certainly did not live up to expectations here in Atlanta, but you could bring him back with the idea of like, well, at least he understands the offense a little bit better. And we're not going to ask him to be the number 2 like the Falcons were asking him to be. We're going to ask him to be maybe the number 3 or number 4 or whatever. But, it's possible that the Falcons could add 4 new wide receivers to replace all 4 of those guys, right? Some of those guys could return like Van Jefferson, but all 4 of them could be outdoor, and Falcons could add, 4 new guys. And I think it's likely that you'll see the Falcons add both free agents and draft wide receivers this offseason. So we'll see, how many new bodies, new faces come into the building, and, whether or not Ike Hilliard can get the most out of those guys. But, so far so good with the Raheem Morris hires. It's not necessarily a all-star staff or anything like that. Oh, this is the greatest coaching staff ever assembled. But, we know that a certain team that may be a few miles up the road of I-85, had recently assembled a quote-unquote all-star staff of coaches, and it didn't quite work out. So I wouldn't put too much stock into, staff rankings or anything. If you come across a website that has like, here's the coaching staff rankings, I wouldn't put too much stock into that. So I think this is a solid group of coaches that Raheem Morris has assembled so far, and we'll see sort of how they fill out, we got the quarterbacks, we got the running backs, we got the receivers. We don't have a tight end. We have an O-line. We have a D-line coach, and we have one of probably 2 or more secondary coaches. And so we got a couple more coaches to be added to the list, and that will probably happen over the next week or 2. So we'll keep you tuned in here on Locked On Falcons. So continue to make us your first listen, but continue to check out today's episode because we'll be taking a deeper dive into the Senior Bowl standouts. Right, we're not going to call them risers and fallers. I'll break down why, but we'll talk about the guys that stood out to me all week long, and we'll look at several of those guys as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further? Ever wonder what adventure can be around the next corner? Our friends at Nissan have a lineup of SUVs with the capabilities to take your adventure to the next level. The 2024 Nissan Rogue is perfect for city drives and great escapes. It's the perfect mid-size crossover for your next adventure. And I can absolutely attest and endorse, since the rental car I had all week long in Mobile this week was a Nissan Rogue. The ride is smooth. It's got great features. You rub elbows with the big wigs here, and you bump into Ian Rappaport, and he's like looking in the car. He's like, "Hey, is that a 12.3-inch HD touchscreen infotainment system?" And I'm like, "Yep, it's great. You no longer need a phone to connect. It has Google Assistant, Google Maps, Google Play Store built right in." And Ian's like, "Wow, that's incredible. What else does Nissan have?" Well, Ian, they have an incredible lineup that also includes the 2024 Nissan Pathfinder that has room up to 8 that can fit all your NFL insiders, expansive cargo capacity for the video equipment that you're bringing, and as well as 284 horsepower, so you can get to the stadium before practice, before anybody else. So take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, and Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure, Mr. Rappaport, by going to shopnissanusa.com. So we're continuing today's Locked On Falcons, talking about some of the Senior Bowl standouts. I don't want to call them risers and fallers, but before we get into that, I do want to plug the Locked On Sports Today 24/7 YouTube streaming channel, the first of its kind right here on YouTube, and that's giving you the biggest stories, all the sports leagues across the globe. And if you're looking for more local flavor, check out the Locked On Sports Atlanta 24/7 streaming YouTube channel. Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, when we talk about the Senior Bowl, we'll talk about the standouts. I do want to caveat it because I do think the tendency is that the Senior Bowl kind of gets a little bit overrated in terms of how much it boosts player stocks. Like, I think there certainly is a percentage of players that, do elevate their stock here. But in terms of like, oh, this guy's going to be like a first round pick now, like, I think that's probably like less than 5% of the players that are here that's a real legit thing that happens, right? It's just one of those things that when you're sitting in the stands watching these guys and there's a whole bunch of people talking around you, the Ian Rappaports of the no, it's not the Ian Rappaport. I'm not sitting with Ian Rappaport. If you guys are not, realizing that, but there's like people like, oh, this guy's shooting up boards, and it's like then the draft rolls around and it's like, nope, this guy that was supposed to go in the first round is a third round pick or a fourth round pick, and a lot of guys that quote unquote made money this week with good practices, wind up lasting to the 5th and 6th round. So you're probably sitting there going, okay, well, Aaron, if the Senior Bowl is kind of overrated when it comes to elevating stock, what is it good for? And it's like, I think it's just another evaluation tool, right? A lot of these players come from a lot of different college systems against different competition, different schemes, and they're asked to do certain things. And you haven't seen them do some of the things that they're potentially going to do in the NFL. And, this week you get to test that, right? We always assume that a lot of these college programs, know how to put their players in a position to succeed, but that's not always true. Like the very prominent example I can think of is like Sheldon Rankins, right? At Louisville, decade or so ago, they played like a 3-4 front and he was asked to hold the point of attack. Then he gets to the Senior Bowl and in the one-on-ones, he's able to pin his ears back and get upfield and attack. And you saw a capable pass rusher during that week. And so it's like, oh, he can do that better than we thought. He wound up being top 20 pick, I think back in 2016, and didn't quite live up to that billing, which, maybe speaks to what I'm talking about. But, I think there is a tendency from folks down here to kind of overhype the importance of this event when it at least comes to draft stock. Like probably the most infamous example in recent memory is Malik Willis being, a top 5 pick because he was like the best, and I probably should use air quotes, best quarterback at the Senior Bowl during that week, or he just had the best arm of any of the quarterbacks at the Senior Bowl that week. So part of me is giving this caveat because I don't want to be that guy that's like, being like, oh, Malik, the Lions should take Malik Willis at 2. Like a lot of people were saying after that Senior Bowl week, and it's like, he's a 3rd round pick. He got drafted where he's supposed to get drafted, that sort of thing. But in terms of talking about some of the standouts, I have a handful of guys that stood out to me all week long, and whether or not these guys are on the Falcons' radar, it's pretty meaningless at this point in time. I'm just talking about the players that stand out, right? And the first player I want to talk about is someone who, is local to Atlanta, at least, played near Atlanta, Ladd McConkey, the Georgia wide receiver, and the type of player that Ladd typically gets drafted is probably not a first rounder, but typically the type of receiver that he is, I think most drafts typically go somewhere in the 50 to 75 range, so a late 2nd, early 3rd round pick. And I think he looked like a player that belonged in that sort of range, and we'll see how the combine may or may not help his draft stock. But, I thought his first day was really good. His second and third days were not quite as dominant as that first day was. But, I think he put himself on the map for a lot of folks this week that, I think we're probably being like, being probably a little bit more judgmental about Ladd McConkey and what type of player that he is, based off of his size, speed, and sort of trying to put him in a certain bucket and say he's this type of player and that has a certain skill set. And it's like, I think he showed enough this week that he can be more than that to a lot of teams. Now, another player that stood out to me all week long was Jackson Powers Johnson, the center from Oregon. And the main reason he stood out to me is, I think he played guard, and I think that's going to really help his draft stock. That could make him not only the top center in this draft class, but potentially one of the top interior offensive linemen in the draft class. That could be a first-round pick because centers typically don't get drafted that high. I remember a couple of years ago when Tyler Linderbaum was getting a lot of hype, people were like, oh, he's going to be a top 10 pick. And I was like, no, he's not. Centers, especially small centers like him, do not get drafted that high. Now, Jackson Powers-Johnson is anything but small, 330 plus pounds, and he's smooth. He's about as smooth as they get at that sort of size. So he played, especially on day 2. He didn't practice on day 3, but he showed that he can play guard, and so that's going to really, centers don't go high, but guards tend to go higher. And so, he could be in the back end of round 1 for a team that's looking for a plug and play guard, as opposed to the sort of typical interior guys that get drafted early is like the tackle that is transitioning to guard but has never played guard before. But it's just like, oh, we don't know if he can play tackle, so we're going to move him to guard. And I think Jackson Powers-Johnson, or JPJ, is the type of guy who was like, oh, he's played guard in college, and if you're looking for a plug and play day 1 starter at guard or center, he's your guy. And so that may elevate his stock more so than some of these other guys. But another play on the defense side of the ball that stood out to me was Darius Robinson out of Missouri. Ryan Nielsen would be absolutely drooling over this guy. He has, 6'5", 286 pounds, over a 7-foot wingspan. This is like the perfect Ryan Nielsen defensive end. So I don't necessarily think he's going to go 17 to Jacksonville, but we'll see. He has been getting a lot of buzz from folks that are more informed than I am, as he might be a first rounder. Again, I tend to think this is maybe a little bit like the Keion White first round hype last year. The Jermaine Johnson, is now going to be a top 10 pick hype that was the previous year based off of, good weeks at the Senior Bowl. So, I like Robinson. I saw him perform really well, beating a number of tackles that are billed as first round picks throughout the week. But, we'll see where his draft stock ultimately is. But he'll probably, I think it's a pretty safe assumption that he'll probably be a top 50 pick, just like Keion White and Jermaine Johnson was. But we'll see. We'll see how high he climbs, especially, based off of his testing. If he tests out of the gym, we might be having a different conversation come March about where he's going to get drafted than I'm willing to have right now. And the last player that stood out to me was cornerback Quinyon Mitchell out of Toledo. Again, another player that sat out the 3rd day, but he balled the first 2 days. He was already getting first round billing by some folks like Dane Brugler, the Athletic, going into the week. And I think he kind of held serves. And, I heard on a recent episode that Dane Brugler did a podcast where he was like, Quinyon Mitchell's now in the CB2 conversation. And it's like, again, I don't know enough about this cornerback class to say otherwise, but like, I legitimately saw a guy that looked like a first round corner in practice this week, because we know that some of these one-on-ones are really these one-on-ones are really geared in favor of the defensive linemen as well as in favor of the wide receivers, right? And so when you see an offensive lineman like Jackson Powers-Johnson, just basically not get beat the entire week, you're like, again, I'm not saying he's this player, but like the last time I remember a player having that type of week was like Zach Martin way back in 2014, where like the only player that beat him that week was like Aaron Donald. And then when a corner is basically, I saw him get beat one time by like Roman Wilson, and I don't think I saw him get beat the rest of the week, but obviously I wasn't watching every single rep. And so like, when you can do that says something. Is those two guys in particular to me really sort of stood out, because it's like the deck is stacked against you to win these sort of one-on-one situations, and when you're consistently winning them at the level that they were winning them all week long, that is impressive. So Quinyon Mitchell, certainly, like that's why like with those two guys, JPJ and Quinyon Mitchell, I'm much more willing to buy in the first round hype with those guys than some of these other guys, right? Because how well they perform. So we'll wrap up here talking about a player that kind of disappointed me. I don't think he had a bad week, but UCLA edge rusher Laiatu Latu, like, again, because of the format, he should have dominated this week, and like I don't think he dominated. And then you couple that with the medical question marks. Like, we were talking about a player that could have potentially been a top 10 pick. And sort of my expectation was like he was going to be the talk of the town with how he performed. And, was again, I want to say relatively quiet week for him. And so I think he didn't perform poorly or anything like that. It was just like this was a situation that he should have, if he's as good as we thought he was, and he was my top edge, just based off of the film, he should have dominated this week. So that was a little disappointing to me personally because, I wanted to, be pushing the Laiatu Latu brand pretty hard this offseason. So, yeah, my brand, I'm not going to say it's crumbling, but, it took a little bit of a hit this week with his performance. He's still a very good player, still a first round player, in my opinion. But, the top 10 conversation, at least for me, it's like, yeah, it's just like, I don't know, that's kind of where I'm at with him. That's why it's a little disappointing because I was ready to be like, Laiatu Latu, this is edge one, no questions asked. This is one of the best pass rushing prospects we've had in recent years. Like he's every bit as good as Will Anderson. He's every bit as good as, insert other Kayvon Thibodeau, these other much hyped pass rushers coming into the NFL. And it's like, I wanted to come out of the week. So that may be on me more so than it is on Latu, but I didn't quite see the player that I was willing to basically, hype up this week, right? But we'll wrap up today's episode talking about the quarterback class and why those guys also kind of held serve this week where, if you like the guy, you probably finished the week liking him. If you didn't like a guy, you probably finished the week not liking that. We'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now, at the start of every new year, every small business owner is asking themselves the same question: what's the one move I can make to take my business to the next level in 2024? And LinkedIn Jobs knows that your success depends on the team that you surround yourself with. And they have created the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. And, LinkedIn is doing that for small businesses. If only there was a LinkedIn Jobs for big businesses like the Atlanta Falcons, maybe they would have been able to get to Raheem Morris a lot quicker than they did. But LinkedIn is not just any job board. LinkedIn has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals. That's a billion with a B, guys. And it makes it the best place to hire. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. It's why small businesses rank LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus their leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs is finding you the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. And guys, DoorDash is absolutely going to be crucial for your watch party for the upcoming big game, whether you're ordering pizza, wings, soda, burgers, nachos, chips, and dip, all the things you crave. And, DoorDash has got you covered. And maybe you already have all those things locked down and you just forgot to order the buns. DoorDash has you covered so that you can kick back and not stress before kickoff. They have the unbeatable deals on everything so you can score this season on groceries, retail, restaurants, and more. Get 50% off up to a $10 value when you spend $15 or more on your first order. Just download the DoorDash app and enter code LOCK23, subject to change, terms apply. Again, that's 50% off up to a $10 value when you spend $15 or more on your first order when you download the DoorDash app and enter code LOCK23, subject to change, terms apply. Don't forget to use that code LOCK23, LOCKED23, for 50% off up to a $10 value on your first order when you download the DoorDash app and spend $15 or more, subject to change, terms apply. So, we'll see if there's any big news over the weekend for the Atlanta Falcons, but more than likely we'll be coming back Sunday for something. Maybe we'll do a mock draft Monday. I don't know. Obviously, Monday is the big day, and we'll have a reaction Monday night for that press conference. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. And we'll also get into some of those positional reviews for the defense that we broke down on offense last week. So that is also in store for you guys in the coming days and weeks. But we'll wrap up here giving my thoughts on the quarterbacks at the Senior Bowl. We went into the week with a sort of, our goggles. I was the Belichick meme with the binoculars checking out the quarterbacks. And, I think all 7 of these guys mostly held serve this week. Like if you liked the guy going into the week, you probably saw things confirming that. If you didn't like a guy going into the week, you probably saw the things that confirm why you didn't like them. And, I went into this week not seeing any of these guys as first rounders. And I came out of the week basically thinking and seeing the same thing, right? We talked about this earlier this week, sort of my tentative grades at this point in time, because I haven't done, final grades on these guys, but my tentative feeling, having watched, 2 or more games from pretty much all these guys going into the week, was Michael Penix Jr. out of Washington was 2nd-round pick. Spencer Rattler out of South Carolina was a 3rd-round pick. Bo Nix out of Oregon was a 4th-round pick. Sam Hartman out of Notre Dame was a 4th-round pick. Joe Milton out of Tennessee was a 5th. Michael Pratt out of Tulane was a 6th. And Carter Bradley out of South Alabama was an undrafted free agent. And I probably wouldn't change any of those grades based off of what I saw this week. I might bump Carter Bradley up to a 7th-round pick because I thought he held his own, especially against a much more talented group of throwers surrounding him on that American team where, there was Joe Milton and Spencer Rattler and Michael Pratt. And, I don't think you looked at him and watched him in practice and we can say, oh, this guy doesn't belong. So maybe I might bump Carter Bradley up to a 7th-round pick. So respect to that. Now, when it comes to whether or not the Falcons should draft any of these guys, we're not there yet for me. I know the comments went pretty hard on the episode I did after day 1, talking about how I thought Penix looked the best on day 1, out of these quarterbacks, and people seem to interpret that as me endorsing the Falcons drafting Penix either in the 1st round or 2nd round, which basically, if you listen to that episode, like I didn't say that at all, but it's fascinating, with the YouTube comments that they tend to see and hear a different episode than what I actually produce, but that will be a conversation for another day. My stance generally at this point in time in the calendar, which seems to be the antithesis of everybody else's stance, is I try to be as open-minded as possible because we know the least about these players and we know the least about these teams, and what they need at this point in the calendar year. So I tend to be open-minded. So when people ask me, like, who do you think they should draft? I'm like, I don't know. Like, ask me again in April. So, we're still early in this process when it comes to the quarterback conversation. I've done more homework on sort of the top 3 guys. And it was interesting hearing some of the buzz this week, as it seems that people are lower on Drake Maye than I would assume they would be, and people are very high on Jayden Daniels, and I find that fascinating. I talked to some people that were low on Drake Maye, and I talked to some people this week that were very high on Drake Maye, and it's going to be an interesting conversation when that process plays out over the next couple of months. For me, I think there's a clear distinction between Drake Maye and Jayden Daniels in terms of, I think Drake Maye is a very, very good prospect that is a, quote unquote perennial top 5 pick. Like, you can put him in any draft class and he'd be a top 5 pick. And I think Jayden Daniels isn't. So that is going to be an interesting conversation throughout this process. So that was probably the biggest development that happened this week, was I just heard a lot of people, especially in quote unquote big draft, sort of being like, yeah, sort of acting like Drake Maye is just a guy. I don't know. It was a weird week for me to hear that sentiment from some folks. And to be like, Jayden Daniels is, flawless or whatever. I don't know. It's an interesting sentiment. So I'm sure we will have plenty more conversations about that as things unfold. I think I've always thought there was a real chance that Jayden Daniels could leapfrog Drake Maye on some teams' draft boards, but I generally thought that was just, that's just the NFL being weird, not necessarily people that evaluate the draft for a living. We all, the internet tends to have a different opinion of quarterbacks than what the NFL does most years. And so that was, to me, what was fascinating about it. Well, but anyway, we'll see how that goes. But that's it, guys. I hope you have a great weekend. I enjoyed my week here down in Mobile. I appreciate all you guys' support. I hope to continue to do this. It's fun chopping it up with the Ian Rappaports as he comments on my Nissan Rogue rental car each and every year. So I look forward to doing that again. Continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check out Locked On NFL Draft, who's going to have you covered as your second listen for all the things that happened this week. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.